Hello, I hope you're having a lovely day today. I am sharing with you today how I make my 100% fresh milled flour sourdough bread loaf, and I'll also be sharing a little bit about my journey with learning how to work with fresh milled flour. Because if you are anything like me, you bought your grain mill full of excitement of being able to mill your own flour, provide nutritious bread for your family with the whole grain. You get it in the mail, set it up, get out your favorite sourdough bread recipe, mill your flour, and bake your bread, only for it to come out dense as a brick, and you are so disappointed. That was me 2.5 years ago. I had such high hopes of milling with fresh milled flour, and then I quickly realized working with fresh milled flour is quite different than working with store-bought flour. I had no idea. I had never heard anyone say, you probably can't use your same bread recipe that you would use for store-bought flour with fresh milled flour. And it took me 1.5 years to find the perfect recipe. I will share more about that recipe in a bit. I have another video on it and it is on my blog. But let's talk about what I was doing. I sort my wheat berries always before I use them. And this is why, because you never know what you're gonna find in here. There's little sticks, rocks, other little debris. I just always sort them, and that way I know none of that is going into our bread. Here is the sourdough. I fed it last night and I fed it again this morning. You can see it just has started going back down. You can see that little line, and so now that's how I know it is ready to use. I know that for regular flour, a lot of people do that testing where you take some sourdough and drop it in water, and if it floats, it's ready. If it sinks, it's not ready. But that has never worked for me with fresh milled flour. I would assume because it has the bran in it, which makes it heavier. I just pay attention to when it starts going down. You can see the line that has formed, and once it starts going down from that line, then I know it is ready to go. All right, so since my starter is ready to go, this is around 3 in the afternoon that I have started this process. Again, I have all of this in written form on my blog. I'll also post my original video that I made with this recipe last year below, because I go into details of everything there. I'm not going to go into measurements or anything on this video. What is different with this video is I will be using my new Bosch mixer. I have used it a few times now with making bread. I actually recorded this video about a month ago, so I've been able to use it several times, and it really does mix the bread dough so beautifully. That being said, you can use any mixer and you can even use your hands. I do think that the mixer is helpful. If you refer to my last video, I was using my vintage mixer when I first started doing this recipe, so you don't have to have any fancy equipment really. I am going to point out this sound. If you have the Nutrimill grain mill, that sound, when you just turn it so the stones are just hitting, is how you're going to get the finest flour that you can get. I wouldn't continue tightening it once you start hearing that squeaky sound, but I would go to that sound because we're keeping the bran in, so we still want the flour to be as fine as we can get it. You can sift it out if you want. I just prefer not to because I think that God made the wheat berry for us to consume all of it together. And it's even better if you sprout your wheat berries. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, because I'll use my sprouted wheat berries and then I won't have any more and I want to make bread, so I'll just use my regular wheat berries. But I can do a separate video on that. It is best to mill your flour right before you're about to use it. If you let it sit on the counter, it will eventually spoil unless you put it in the freezer. So I always like to mill it right as I need it. So what I'm doing right here is I am mixing my sourdough starter, warm water, not too warm, just warm enough. And then I will add my flour in, and then I'll let it sit for 40 minutes to an hour to just fully soak. So this is called autolyzing, and when you use fresh milled flour, it's very important to let it soak before you knead it. When you are making your fresh milled sourdough bread, you have to change your expectations of what it's going to be like. You cannot think that your bread is going to be exactly like white bread. It's not going to. You're never going to get those air bubbles unless you do one of those recipes where you use mostly store-bought flour and then a little tiny bit of fresh milled flour. I don't know how many recipes I had found when I got my grain mill that's like fresh milled flour bread recipe, and I click on it and a quarter of the flour was fresh milled and the rest was store-bought. Here I am adding my salt. After the 40 minutes to an hour, you'll then add the salt. So I was so confused on why so many people called their bread recipes fresh milled flour when only a quarter of the recipe was with fresh milled flour, and that's why the photo looked so beautiful, was because it was mostly store-bought flour. When I first started sharing about this, one of you guys had messaged me and said that a popular blogger had admitted that her recipe of fresh milled sourdough bread, she advertises it as using 100% fresh milled flour, yet she ended up saying somewhere else that the photo for that recipe is a bread loaf made with store-bought flour because people wouldn't click on the recipe if she showed what the bread loaf made with fresh milled flour actually looked like. Let's see how it looks. Oh, that looks really good. And there's a real problem with that, because then you make bread and it doesn't look anything like the photo and you think you did something wrong. So that is my biggest advice. You're gonna have to start thinking of your bread as more of a rustic style of bread, of how God intended it to be, with the bran, with the endosperm and the germ. So you're getting the fiber, the vitamin E, all of the minerals, and the taste is amazing. But the texture is definitely going to be different than your store-bought flour sourdough bread. What I did there was 2 5-minute intervals of kneading. So after that 45 minutes to an hour of letting it sit and then adding your salt, I turned it on low, set a timer for 5 minutes, let it knead for 5 minutes, turn it off, let it sit for 5 minutes, and then did another 5 minutes of mixing, and that I found is key. I have tried recently doing 15 minutes straight of kneading, and it got way over kneaded, I believe. I think that's what went wrong with that bread recipe. So I've gone back to the 5-minute intervals, and then you are done with the mixer. If you want to see more about that Bosch mixer, I have my link below, and that will give you $20 off, even the sale price. So now that we're done with the mixing, we are doing the stretch and fold intervals. You can do this 4 to 5 to 6 times, and I would just do it over the course of 1 to 2 hours. Sometimes it's easier to set an alarm to make sure that you remember to do it. If you're staying around it, just whenever you think of it, go over and do a few stretches and folds. I always find it is easier to wet my hands first before doing this, because this is a sticky dough, and that helps prevent the dough from sticking all over your fingers when your hands are wet. And then always cover it up with your damp cotton towel each time. So after you do 4 to 6 stretches and folds, you then want to let it sit and rise. And the time you allow it to sit really depends on the temperature of your house. I usually estimate around 3-ish hours. I'll check on it and see where it's at. Probably 2 to 3 hours actually. And if it's about 1.5 times in size, then it's ready to go. I do one more stretch and fold, and then I pull it across the counter for tension a few times, and to me this is just so satisfying. Now you can let it sit on the counter too long, and that's how you end up with flat bread. So if you're doing this recipe and you're getting flat bread, I would shorten the amount of time that you're letting it sit out on the counter. So after I do this, I let it sit out for another hour, and then I will put it in the refrigerator overnight. It was around 9 p.m. and I forgot to record that part, but I just take a basket, lay a cotton towel in it, sprinkle some flour in it, put the dough in it, and then cover it up, and then I'll stick it into a plastic bag, tie it up, put it in the fridge overnight, and then in the morning I will put my Dutch oven in the oven at 450 degrees and let it sit in there for an hour. Then I will take the dough ball out of the fridge, and then I will put it on parchment paper, do my little cut marks across the top, then put it in the oven and let it cook first with the lid on for 17 minutes, and then take the lid off and let it cook for another 21 minutes. Also, leather glove oven mitts to me are everything when it comes to handling hot Dutch ovens. I don't know how many times I burned my arms before getting those leather glove oven mitts. They go all the way up your arm and also really help keep the heat out, so that way you're not burning your hands through the oven mitts when you're taking this hot Dutch oven out of the oven. Looking good. When it is done, I immediately take it out of the Dutch oven and put it on a wooden cutting board, and normally I will let it sit there because it will continue to cook. However, this morning I needed it for lunch for Scott's sandwiches, so I did end up cutting into it right away, which I hate to do. I love letting it sit there and cook. I usually let it cool down completely before I cut into it, but I needed it, so I did cut into it. But look how beautiful it is. It tasted amazing. And I did forget to mention, this was made with hard white wheat berries. I love the taste of the hard white wheat berry sourdough. Sometimes I will split it with hard red wheat and hard white wheat. If you're having trouble using the hard red wheat, I would switch over to using hard white, getting the hang of that, then start adding in your red berries. And that's how I make my fresh milled flour sourdough bread. I hope it was helpful. I will put all of those links that I mentioned below, and I encourage you just to keep trying a recipe until you find one that works for you. even if it's not this one, because you will end up finding one. It just takes patience and keeping in mind that the texture is definitely going to be different than your store-bought flour bread, but you're getting so many more nutrients from this bread. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day.